Brandi Ramsbottom Deal was a 41-year-old mother of three, residing in Burke County, North Carolina. Known for her warm demeanor and dedication to her family, Brandi was eagerly anticipating the arrival of her fourth child. Her life was a tapestry woven with love, resilience, and hope for the future. On February 10th, 2023, Brandi's life was abruptly and violently ended, just hours before she was scheduled to give birth. She was fatally shot in her home. The community was left in shock, grappling with the senselessness of the crime and mourning the loss of both Brandi and her unborn child. The investigation quickly identified two suspects, Dylan James Rogers, 32, and Tammy Duckworth Boone, 52. According to the Burke County Sheriff's Office, Rogers fired multiple shots into Brandi's trailer from a moving vehicle driven by Boone. The motive was reportedly a personal dispute, though the specifics remain unclear. Rogers was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and murder of an unborn child. After a 2-week trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Boone, on the other hand, faced charges of discharging a firearm into an occupied dwelling and obstruction of justice. She pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 55 to 78 months in prison. The case highlighted the devastating impact of violence and the importance of justice. District Attorney Scott Riley emphasized that while no sentence could undo the loss, the verdict brought a measure of closure to Brandi's family and the community. Brandi Deal's final day began as a day of anticipation. Her hospital bag was packed. Her children were aware that by evening, they'd be welcoming a new sibling. Brandi had just spoken with her mother the day prior, excited and hopeful about the future. She had carefully prepared the nursery, washed the baby's clothes, and finalized her birthing plan. But what she couldn't have known was that her fate had already been sealed by the violent decisions of two people, Dylan James Rogers and Tammy Duckworth Boone. Shortly after midnight on February 10th, 2023, multiple gunshots shattered the quiet of Brandi's rural neighborhood. Witnesses later testified that they heard a vehicle drive by and saw muzzle flashes pierce the darkness. Inside the trailer, Brandi was struck multiple times. She collapsed in a pool of blood. Her unborn child, who was due that very day, died alongside her. By the time paramedics arrived, there was nothing that could be done. Detectives from the Burke County Sheriff's Office responded within minutes. The scene was chaotic, yet chillingly precise. No signs of forced entry. No robbery. Just cold, calculated violence. Shell casings were found outside, confirming that the shots had been fired from the vehicle as it passed the trailer. Law enforcement knew immediately. They weren't dealing with an accident. This was a targeted killing. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives canvassed the area, collecting surveillance footage, speaking to neighbors, and analyzing Brandi's phone records. What they uncovered pointed to a personal vendetta. Dylan James Rogers had a history with Brandi. One tied not to romance, but to past disputes and lingering resentment. Reports indicated Brandi had previously confronted Rogers about threats made against her family. Those threats, it seemed, escalated to fatal action. Further complicating the case was Tammy Duckworth Boone. At 52 years old, she had no prior violent record. She was the driver of a vehicle from which the fatal shots were fired. Though she didn't pull the trigger, prosecutors argued her role was instrumental. She drove the car. She helped conceal evidence. And she fled the scene without calling for help. Her actions weren't passive. They were complicit. When investigators pulled Rogers in for questioning, he showed no remorse. Forensics later confirmed that gunshot residue was found on his clothing. The weapon used in the shooting was recovered during a search of a residence tied to him. The case was airtight. The bullets matched. The motive was becoming clearer. A deliberate act of revenge rooted in rage and cowardice. The community, meanwhile, was reeling. Candlelight vigils were held in Brandi's honor. Her children, now robbed of their mother and unborn sibling, were placed in the care of family members. Local news outlets covered the tragedy extensively, and social media became flooded with tributes. Brandi's name became a symbol not only of senseless violence, but of the irreplaceable loss a family now had to endure. As word spread, so too did outrage. Why would someone kill a woman mere hours before childbirth? What kind of hatred could lead to such a monstrous decision? These were questions the public wanted answers to, and the courtroom would soon provide them. When the charges were announced, they were severe. Dylan Rogers was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Brandi and one for her unborn child. He also faced firearm possession charges, aggravated assault, and obstruction of justice. Tammy Boone, despite her lesser role, was charged with aiding and abetting obstruction and felony discharge of a weapon into an occupied dwelling. The public demanded justice, and they would soon get their day in court. As the days turned into weeks, the Burke County District Attorney's Office began preparing for one of the most emotionally charged cases the county had ever seen. The evidence was strong, but prosecutors knew they'd be going to battle in front of a jury. This wasn't just about facts. It was about accountability. The murder of Brandi Deal and her unborn child had become a lightning rod for discussions about domestic violence, premeditated murder, and the value of unborn life in the justice system. The legal strategy centered around the idea of dual homicide. North Carolina law allows for a person to be charged with the murder of an unborn child if it is demonstrated that the fetus was viable and that the suspect acted with malice. In Brandi's case, there was no ambiguity. She was full term. She had scheduled her delivery. There was medical evidence confirming the baby was healthy just hours before the shooting. The case would treat both deaths as equal acts of murder. Dylan Rogers appeared in court for the first time with a public defender and showed little emotion. He entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Scott Riley, filed notice that they would seek the maximum penalty allowed by law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the state had the option to pursue the death penalty, they chose not to, citing the strength of the evidence and emotional toll on Brandi's surviving family. Boone's case unfolded differently. She quickly opted to take a plea deal. She pled guilty to charges of discharging a firearm into an occupied dwelling and obstruction of justice. In return, she agreed to testify against Rogers. The court sentenced her to a prison term of 55 to 78 months, a decision that sparked outrage among some members of the public who believe her sentence was too lenient. Still, prosecutors argued that her cooperation would be instrumental in ensuring that Rogers never walked free again. The trial of Dylan Rogers began in January 2024. Jury selection took days. Attorneys on both sides worked carefully, aware that the case was saturated with media coverage and local emotion. Witnesses were called. Forensic experts testified about the ballistic matches. Surveillance footage was played, showing Boone's car in the vicinity of the shooting at the exact time gunshots were heard. Neighbors testified about the sound of the shots and their recollections of the moments that followed. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Brandi's teenage daughter. She had been home during the shooting. She spoke, through tears, about running to her mother's room and finding her on the floor, bleeding and unconscious. Her voice cracked as she described trying to call 911, begging them to save her mother. That testimony gripped the courtroom. Even members of the jury wept. Boone, called to stand as part of her plea agreement, confirmed the prosecution's theory. She admitted that she drove Rogers to Brandi's trailer that night. She admitted that she knew he had a firearm. She admitted she knew what he intended to do. Her words removed any remaining doubt that this was anything less than a premeditated killing. The defense tried to introduce arguments about Rogers' mental health and prior trauma. They attempted to frame the act as impulsive rather than calculated, but the evidence was unrelenting. Rogers had expressed anger toward Brandi in text messages weeks before the murder. He had made threats, and he had taken concrete steps, choosing the weapon, the time, the location, and the escape route. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Dylan Rogers to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no celebration, no relief, only solemn silence. Justice, in its purest legal sense, had been served. But a mother was still gone. A child who never took its first breath had been erased. And a family had to pick up the pieces of a life brutally cut short. After the verdict was read and Dylan Rogers was escorted out of the courtroom, the echoes of Brandi Deal's murder did not fade. Her name remained etched in the minds of those who had followed the case from the beginning. But justice in a legal sense rarely brings healing to the hearts of those left behind. For Brandi's children, it meant life without the woman who had raised them, fought for them, and protected them until the end. Her teenage daughter, who testified during the trial, returned to a home filled with memories and absence. Brandi's baby shower decorations still lingered in the corner of the room. The crib sat untouched. Tiny clothes folded neatly in a drawer would never be worn. Family members did what they could to provide support, but no amount of comfort could replace the void left by Brandi's violent death. The trauma was fresh and it cut deep. The community responded with both outrage and unity. Vigils were held throughout Burke County. Ribbons, candles, and photos lined the sidewalks outside Brandi's home. Local mothers organized community events to honor Brandi and bring awareness to domestic violence and maternal safety. Some began to advocate for stricter laws regarding fetal homicide, urging lawmakers to enhance protections for pregnant women and their unborn children. Media coverage continued. Reporters revisited Brandi's life, painting a picture of a woman who was strong-willed and nurturing. Her friends described her as funny, fierce, and devoted to her children. She worked tirelessly to provide for her family. Her pregnancy had been unexpected, but she embraced it with optimism and courage. She had even picked out a name for her baby. That name, never publicly released, was etched into her gravestone alongside hers. Dylan Rogers remained unrepentant. From behind bars, he gave no statements to the press, no apology to the family, no effort at reconciliation. His life sentence ensured he would never again walk free, but to those who loved Brandi, it wasn't enough. There would never be enough. As for Tammy Boone, her story unfolded with less public scrutiny. Her sentence of 55 to 78 months meant she would be out of prison in a matter of years. Many believed that she got off easy. Despite her role as a driver, her decision to remain silent during the immediate aftermath of the crime left many questioning whether justice had truly been served in full. Even with her testimony during Rogers' trial, public opinion remained divided. In the months that followed the trial, Brandi's mother stepped forward as a family spokesperson. In interviews, she held back tears as she spoke of Brandi's dreams for her new baby, her joy in motherhood, and her plans to start a home business. Her mother said she hoped people would remember Brandi not for how she died, but for how she lived, with love, strength, and an unbreakable bond with her children. School counselors worked closely with Brandi's surviving children. Trauma specialists were brought in. The court provided guardianship assistance to ensure they would remain with trusted family members. Donations poured in from across the country after local media published a fundraiser. Though it didn't erase the pain, it provided a measure of financial stability during a time of unimaginable grief. Beyond the personal tragedy, this case left a lasting mark on North Carolina law enforcement and prosecutors. It became a case study in how domestic violence, left unchecked, can escalate into irreversible violence. Lawmakers began reviewing current statutes related to fetal homicide. Advocates pushed for more robust protective measures for expectant mothers, including emergency response programs for pregnant women facing threats. Brandi's story became part of a larger conversation. She was no longer just a local woman tragically murdered. She became a national symbol, a face that reminded people of the real cost of inaction, the real pain of loss, and the importance of justice for victims too often ignored until it's too late. But for those who loved her, Brandi was never a symbol. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and every day without her is another day spent remembering what was taken in the life that might have been. In the quiet weeks that followed the verdict, the media buzz began to die down. But for Brandi Deal's family, there was no end, no relief, no way to return to normal. Every routine, every meal, every morning school run, every quiet evening was now accompanied by the empty space where Brandi once stood. The mother who once held her children, taught them to brush their teeth, walked them to the bus stop, and reminded them they were loved, was no longer there. Her eldest child began therapy, processing grief that no child should carry. She struggled to sleep. She began journaling, filling notebook pages with letters to her mom. Her handwriting was shaky. Her words, though youthful, were raw and deeply personal. She wrote about her brothers, about the way the house was too quiet, about how unfair it all felt, and about how she would do everything to keep her mother's memory alive. Extended family stepped in to try to maintain a sense of stability. Brandi's younger children were confused. Too young to understand the permanence of death, they asked when Mommy was coming home. The adults around them tried to explain the unexplainable. They pointed to the sky. They showed pictures. But nothing could fill the space left by the woman who had been the center of their world. The hospital where Brandi had planned to deliver kept her file on record longer than usual. Nurses spoke of the heartbreak they felt when they learned what had happened. One nurse, who had been assigned to her upcoming delivery, left a note on the bulletin board in the maternity ward. "We were ready to help you bring life into the world. We grieve your loss with heavy hearts." In schools and churches across Burke County, Brandi's story became part of discussions around safety, domestic threats, and the overlooked vulnerabilities of expectant mothers. Her name was invoked during panels, workshops, and advocacy forums. Local officials, prompted by the public reaction, began reviewing protocols for responding to threats against pregnant women, especially those made by individuals with prior histories of violence or intimidation. Meanwhile, Dylan Rogers' name became one associated with destruction. People speculated about his motives. What had pushed him to such calculated cruelty? He wasn't in a romantic relationship with Brandi. He wasn't a father to her unborn child. But there were rumors of escalating feuds, of arguments laced with threats, of hostility that spiraled until it detonated in gunfire. No definitive motive was ever revealed in court, and Rogers refused all interviews after his sentencing. He offered no apologies. He left no explanation. What was clear was that Brandi had expressed concern in the weeks leading up to her death. Family members told investigators that she had voiced worry about individuals targeting her home. She had even considered staying with her mother for safety, but ultimately chose to remain in her home as she prepared for childbirth. She didn't want to disrupt her children's routine. She thought she could wait it out. She believed it would blow over. It didn't. In a community where people still left their doors unlocked and waved to one another from front porches, the execution-style killing of a pregnant mother in her own home felt like a violation of everything they believed was safe and sacred. Parents became more protective. Pregnant women walked through parking lots more cautiously. And neighbors who once only exchanged pleasantries now exchanged phone numbers, just in case. Grief turned into a form of activism. Friends of Brandi formed a small advocacy group focused on maternal justice. They began lobbying local leaders. They distributed flyers. They created social media campaigns with Brandi's face at the center, smiling, hopeful, and visibly pregnant in her final photographs. Their message was simple: this must never happen again. The prosecutor in the case, Scott Riley, gave a series of interviews in the months following the trial. In each one, he expressed that while justice had been served in the courtroom, the emotional damage would linger for generations. He described Brandi's children as brave and resilient. He praised the jury for their courage. And he acknowledged that the law, though powerful, often comes too late for those it was designed to protect. As the first anniversary of Brandi Deal's murder approached, grief had not lessened. It had simply changed form. It was quieter now, less public, but heavier in its permanence. For her family, it was present in every holiday, every birthday, every reminder that life was moving forward without her. Brandi's children grew older. Their memories of her now preserved in snapshots, videos, and whispered bedtime stories. The youngest still asked for her. The eldest clung to what she could remember. In the months after sentencing, Brandi's mother made it her mission to ensure her daughter's story did not fade into the background. She petitioned for a local proclamation recognizing February 10th as Brandi Deal Day in Burke County. The resolution passed unanimously. That date, once a day of death, would now also be one of remembrance. On that day, the community gathered in silence and solidarity. They held a candlelight vigil at the foot of Brandi's front yard. Neighbors, family, teachers, and strangers, all drawn by her story, stood in silence as her name was spoken aloud. Brandi had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of a system that failed to intervene, a woman who asked for help, voiced fear, and was still left vulnerable. The advocacy work that grew from her death led to tangible changes. Domestic violence shelters expanded their outreach to include women in the late stages of pregnancy. The Sheriff's Department began hosting educational forums on how to recognize threats that escalate Community policing, especially in rural areas, was reevaluated for responsiveness. One significant shift was a legislative proposal brought forward at the state level, nicknamed Brandi's Law. The bill aimed to enhance penalties for crimes resulting in the death of a viable fetus and create special protective classifications for pregnant women facing threats or stalking. It was backed by both parties, a rare moment of unity born from tragedy. Though it faced the usual procedural hurdles, the momentum behind it was undeniable. Inside the prison where Dylan Rogers was housed, word of Brandi's legacy reached him. He remained silent. No statement. No outreach. No expression of remorse. For a man whose actions permanently altered the course of multiple lives, his refusal to speak only deepened the public's disdain. His silence, in many ways, became his final betrayal. Not just to Brandi, but to the society he violated. Tammy Boone's release date loomed closer. Though her testimony had helped convict Rogers, her sentence of 55 to 78 months had become a bitter reminder for many of the limits of the legal system. Brandi's family made it clear that while Boone would walk free, they would never forgive her role in that night. Boone would live the rest of her life with the label of convicted felon. But for Brandi's family, that wasn't justice. It was logistics. Meanwhile, Brandi's story continued to ripple outward. True crime blogs began writing in-depth analyses of her case. Documentaries referenced her name in episodes about maternal homicide. She became part of national discussions on how legal systems define personhood, how they measure loss, and how they punish the destruction of life that never had a chance to begin. People who had never met her began to care. They followed her case. They sent letters to her family. They donated to funds set up in her children's names. They printed shirts that read, "Justice for Brandi and Baby Deal." The slogans were simple. The message wasn't. Her death had awakened something in people, a raw awareness that safety, even in the quiet corners of small-town America, was never guaranteed. In private moments, Brandi's mother said she sometimes imagined what that day might look like if it had gone as planned. Brandi waking up early, checking into the hospital, holding her baby for the first time, her children coming to meet their new sibling, laughter, joy, family photos in hospital beds. Instead, she was left with a headstone, a name carved into cold stone, shared by two people, one who never saw daylight. In the aftermath of the legal proceedings and after the initial media spotlight faded, what remained for the Deal family was a kind of silence that never fully quieted. Trauma, unlike physical wounds, doesn't close up. It lingers in everyday moments. It rewrites the future. Brandi's family didn't just lose a mother, daughter, sister. They lost a future filled with birthday parties, milestones, family photos, and newborn's first steps. Brandi's eldest daughter, once vibrant and outgoing, became withdrawn. Counselors and therapists were brought in regularly. Her grades slipped. Her attention waned. She carried something far heavier than any teenager should ever have to bear. Memories of finding her mother, blood pooling on the floor, sirens approaching far too late, and the sound of unanswered prayers echoing in her mind. There were nights she couldn't sleep. She would walk down the hallway just to look into her mother's empty bedroom. The crib was gone now, packed away, but the echo of what should have been still lingered in the air. That room had once been a place of excitement and preparation. It had turned into a place of death. Brandi's mother, a quiet but fiercely loving woman, became the new backbone of the family. She had to be. She couldn't afford to collapse under the weight of her grief. Every morning, she made breakfast, packed school lunches, braided hair, tied shoelaces. But behind every gesture was a memory of her own daughter doing those same things not so long ago. Her grief was private, but never absent. She kept Brandi's belongings carefully preserved. Her clothes remained folded in drawers. Her favorite lotion still sat on the bathroom counter. Her handwriting, still pinned to the refrigerator in the form of a note reminding the kids to clean their rooms, remained untouched. Her scent lingered in the fabric of her favorite sweater, which her mother sometimes held late at night when the silence of the house became unbearable. People in town, while supportive, slowly returned to their routines. Life, after all, keeps moving. But for the Deal family, time had split into two parts. before Brandi's murder and after. Holidays were hollow. Her birthday, once a day of celebration, was now a date marked by tears, by candles lit in mourning rather than joy. Her absence was loudest during the quietest moments, when the kids laughed and she wasn't there to hear it, or when her youngest asked why other kids had moms and he didn't. Her youngest didn't fully grasp death. He only knew that something had gone wrong, that his mommy had gone to heaven before she could bring the baby home, that his life no longer looked like it did in the photos hanging in the hallway. There were occasional well-meaning people who asked the family if they were healing. The answer was always the same. There's no healing from this, only surviving it. Brandi's friends, those closest to her, became keepers of her memory. They continued posting on social media, sharing old videos of her laughing, dancing, holding her kids. One friend in particular created a private group for others who'd lost loved ones to domestic or targeted violence. That group quickly grew, attracting women from all over the country, women who saw their own stories in Brandi's. They saw their own fears, their own ignored warning signs. They saw what could have happened to them. That was the part that haunted many of them. It could have been me. Brandi wasn't involved in crime. She didn't live a reckless life. She wasn't in an abusive relationship at the time of her death. She wasn't doing anything wrong. And yet, she was hunted, ambushed, erased. Her story challenged every false narrative that violence only finds those who invite it. Brandi was doing everything right. She was building a life, preparing to bring new life into the world, focused on her children and looking forward. She never saw the darkness coming, and when it arrived, it didn't hesitate. One of the most painful parts of Brandi Deal's murder was a child she was about to bring into the world. A baby boy, full term, hours from delivery. A heartbeat, a name, a life waiting to begin. But when Brandi died, so did he, and in the eyes of the law, he didn't always count. That's the brutal truth many learned from Brandi's story. In North Carolina, like many other states, legal definitions around fetal homicide are complicated. There are layers: viability, gestational age, intent, context. And while Dylan Rogers was charged with first-degree murder for killing Brandi, the death of her unborn child was not treated as a separate homicide. This reality enraged her family and sparked widespread debate. Brandi's child had a name. She had packed his hospital bag. She had installed the car seat. Her children had picked out toys for their baby brother. He had a future. And yet, under the law, he was not officially recognized as a murder victim. Brandi's family and their growing circle of supporters began pushing for recognition, not just for her, but for her baby. They launched a public campaign demanding change. They circulated petitions, gathered signatures, and spoke to media outlets. Their message was simple. If a child is capable of living outside the womb, their death in an act of violence should be recognized under the law. They weren't alone. Across the country, families who had lost unborn children to violent crimes reached out. Many had faced the same legal wall. Their grief had been compounded by the system's refusal to name their loss. Together, they formed alliances. They told their stories. They put faces, however young, on the issue. What began as local mourning became a statewide issue. Lawmakers, many of whom had never closely considered the nuance of fetal homicide laws, began to listen. Some met with Brandi's family. Others reviewed the trial and the facts surrounding her death. Slowly, the tide began to shift. But even with potential legislative changes on the horizon, no new law could undo the reality that Brandi's baby boy never took a breath. He was buried with his mother. The casket was double-lined, built for two. In it were the clothes she had planned to bring him home in, a tiny beanie, and a stuffed elephant bought by his siblings. The baby's name was inscribed beneath Brandi's on the shared headstone. It was a name only their family knew, a name they whispered in prayers and wrote in journals, but never got to hear aloud in a hospital room. The funeral service was devastating. The chapel overflowed. People stood in silence as the tiny casket was carried down the aisle. Brandi's children sobbed as they released doves into the air. Her mother clutched a photo of the last ultrasound. It showed her grandson's face, his little hands, his tiny nose. He was ready for life. He just never got the chance. The doctors who were scheduled to assist with the delivery sent a letter of condolence. It was heartfelt and deeply emotional. They wrote about how they had prepared the delivery room, how Brandi had been so excited during her checkups, how her baby had been perfectly healthy. They ended the letter by saying, "Though we never met him, he mattered to us." That line, "he mattered to us," was later used by Brandi's family in their advocacy. It appeared on T-shirts, posters, and banners. Her unborn son became a symbol in his own right, not just of what was lost, but of what justice still needed to address. And the truth is, the loss of a child like Brandi's doesn't exist in isolation. It echoes. It's felt every day by families who have prepared nurseries, picked out names, planned futures, and then had them ripped away in moments of violence. When Brandi was shot, her baby was still alive. It took time for his heartbeat to stop. And during that time, nothing was done to save him, because nothing could be. And yet, for the law to say his death didn't warrant separate prosecution, that was a cruelty of its own. For Brandi's surviving children, the grief doubled. They hadn't just lost their mother. They had lost a baby brother they had waited for with joy and anticipation. They had written letters to him. They had picked out outfits. They had argued over who would hold him first. All of that vanished in an instant. Their drawings, once taped to the nursery walls, were now preserved in a scrapbook kept by their grandmother, a quiet memorial for the life that never began and the family that never got to grow. Brandi Deal's murder was not just the loss of a young mother and her unborn child. It was a wound that pierced the soul of a quiet North Carolina community, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, a town where violence felt far away, until it wasn't. In the weeks after the murder, the town of Morganton carried a quiet shame. People spoke in hushed tones in grocery store aisles. At gas stations, cashiers looked down. Her death forced people to confront the false sense of security they'd wrapped themselves in. If Brandi could be hunted down in her own driveway after school drop-off in broad daylight, then no one was truly safe. The Deal residence became something of a landmark, not for tourists or curiosity seekers, but for those who came to pay respect. Crosses were planted in the yard, one for Brandi, one for her son. Handmade signs appeared at the base of a nearby tree. Justice for Brandi. Protect mothers. Gone too soon. Flowers, some fresh, some faded, were laid at the edge of the property for months. There were candlelight vigils, town hall meetings. Conversations that had been avoided for years now came roaring to the surface. Women spoke openly about threats they'd received, partners who turned violent, systems that failed them when they asked for help. Men questioned their silence, their inaction, and how easily danger could hide in plain sight. The town church dedicated an entire Sunday sermon to Brandi, not just to her death, but to the idea of prevention, of community vigilance, of listening when someone says they're afraid. The pastor reminded the congregation that it wasn't enough to pray after a tragedy. There had to be change before the next one. Some tried to distance themselves from the story. They said it was a personal matter, that Rogers was a lone wolf, not reflective of town. But others refused that narrative. This was not a freak incident. This was a man whose anger had been building for years, who made threats, who had followers and enablers. He was part of this community, and this community had to reckon with that. The high school where Brandi had once been a student created a scholarship in her name. It was given to a young woman with aspirations of becoming a nurse, just like Brandi had once dreamed. The girl who received the scholarship wept as she read Brandi's story, understanding that the money came from a life cut short. On social media, the hashtag Justice for Brandi began trending again months later, when news broke that a judge had denied Dylan Rogers' first appeal. He had filed, predictably, claiming ineffective counsel and constitutional violations. The court's rejection of his appeal was swift and decisive. It offered no solace to the Deal family, but it reaffirmed that his conviction stood. In the same period, Tammy Boone applied for early release under a state program aimed at reducing prison overcrowding. The Deal family mobilized instantly. They launched a petition, gathering tens of thousands of signatures in days. They wrote directly to the parole board, arguing that her release would send a dangerous message to other accomplices in violent crimes. That cooperation would always mean leniency, regardless of the damage done. Boone's request was denied. Her scheduled release remained on track, still far too short in the eyes of Brandi's loved ones, but at least not hastened. Brandi's story also inspired legislative movement. Local officials worked alongside state lawmakers to draft a broader version of Brandi's law, now encompassing not only protection for pregnant women, but also harsher penalties for individuals who facilitate, plan, or assist in premeditated violent crimes against them. The law would also mandate better training for officers responding to threats made against pregnant individuals, including stalker behavior or online harassment escalating toward violence. The community's transformation wasn't overnight. It came in steps, sometimes painful, sometimes slow, but each one marked a refusal to forget. Brandi's name became shorthand for never again. For every mother walking her child to school, for every young woman working a night shift, for every daughter who had once been told, "You're safe here," Brandi's story became a cautionary tale, yes, but also a call to vigilance, to solidarity, and to action. She hadn't chosen to be a martyr, but that's what her death had made her. Brandi's children are her most living legacy. Each of them carries a part of her with them. Her smile, her voice, her resilience. In interviews conducted years later, her eldest daughter spoke openly about the pain of losing her mother, the years spent in therapy, and the anger that once consumed her. But what stood out most in her words was her strength. She became an advocate. She began speaking at events for domestic violence prevention. She stood before crowds, with her mother's photo pinned to her shirt, and told strangers what happened in that driveway, how life can end in seconds, how no one listened until it was too late. She was young when her mother died, but the trauma had aged her. It had sharpened her voice. She was no longer just a survivor. She had become a fighter. For her mother, for her siblings, for women like Brandi. Brandi's mother, though weathered by grief, remained steadfast. She took on the full-time role of guardian, protector, and anchor. Every Christmas, she made sure Brandi's traditions lived on. The same cinnamon rolls in the oven. The same songs playing while the tree was decorated. She taught Brandi's children about their mother in stories, photos, journals. She refused to let Brandi be forgotten. She worked quietly but persistently with lawmakers behind the scenes, pushing for every clause of Brandi's law to be enforced. She reviewed drafts, met with victims' advocates, attended hearings. She was determined to make sure no other mother experienced what she had. Receiving a call that her pregnant daughter had been murdered and her killer still had rights. Over time, Brandi's law expanded beyond North Carolina. States with similar gaps in legal protection began reviewing their own statutes. Some adopted nearly identical language. Others used her case as a precedent for enhancing existing fetal homicide laws. Brandi's story was cited in legal journals, advocacy group presentations, and legislative sessions. Her name appeared in places she never would have imagined. In courtrooms, in campaign speeches, in petitions signed by tens of thousands. And the conversations her death started began to reshape how people saw crime, not just in terms of legal definitions, but in human impact, the role of accomplices, the warning signs ignored, the cracks in the justice system where women fall through, the brutal truth that doing everything right isn't always enough to survive. The house where Brandi once lived was eventually sold. The new owners knew the story. They bought it with full awareness, vowing to treat the space with respect. They kept the rose bush Brandi had planted in the front yard. They allowed the Deal family to visit once a year, to stand where Brandi had once stood, and to grieve on their terms. A mural was later painted downtown, a collaboration between local artists and Brandi's family. It depicted a mother with a child in her arms, surrounded by light. Below it were the words, "You never got to take your first breath, but we will breathe for you. You never got to speak, but we will speak for you." The mural became a symbol of Brandi, of her unborn son, of every woman silenced by violence. Her case is now taught in criminal justice courses at several universities, not just as a lesson in law, but as a case study in systemic failure and how communities respond to tragedy. And through all of this, Through years of grief advocacy, media attention, and legislative reform, Brandi's family continues to live, to endure, to remember. They don't romanticize her death. They don't paint her as a saint. They remember her as a real woman, a mother who laughed loudly, loved fiercely, worked hard, and protected her kids with everything she had. They remember her as someone who deserved to live, not to be a headline. They keep her memory alive not because she was perfect, but because she mattered, and in the end, that's what Brandi Deal left behind. Not just a story of what was taken, but a movement that refuses to let her death be in vain. Like this video and subscribe to No Justice Nation for more in-depth, no-fluff true crime stories that demand justice, tell the truth, and never look away.